And I think the more people give themselves permission to stand in their own light by expressing their own authentic thoughts, feelings, and positions, the more it will challenge this assumption that truth is black or white, that most truth doesn't happen in some kind of universal capacity. And it's all gray. And that's one of the oldest tricks in the book for how the bourgeois, or how the folks who have all this institutional privilege and influence, in the top 1%, keep one half the poor fighting the other half. They keep all of us just at each other's throats, being convinced that there's irrevocably clear right way or wrong way, and judging each other, shaming each other, trying to scare the other off of their position. It's the yucky part of tribalism.
As we're recording this, for those of you who are listening, the DNC convention, the presidential convention, I believe it's ended today or ended yesterday. But I was very present to what you're talking about when I was looking at the footage. Vice President Harris Kamala put out this Instagram post of people at her convention with, and they were like waving American flags. It was something very patriotic. I can't remember exactly what it was. And then the next slide, it was people presumably from a Trump convention that was basically saying, mass deportation now, And then when I go and look at, Republican or conservative news or social media or whatever it is, it's the script is completely inversed, and it's like, they're the patriots, they're the ones that love America, and it's these other ones, and it's, it's such a basic structure for a story, right? A hero, a victim, and a villain. And all you got to do is just, assign people to different roles. And it will always fascinate me how effective that narrative structure is, regardless of whether it's politics or something else.
It's truly scary.
Welcome to Therapy versus the World. I'm your host, Joe Nucci, and today I am very, very excited to sit down with Logan Cohen. Logan, you may know from his social media fame, Healing Humanity 777. He's a psychotherapist, a coach, and makes some really, really great content for all of you out there. And I'm very, very excited to talk to him about a variety of topics today. Welcome, Logan. I'm so happy you're on the show.
Thanks for having me, Joe. When I hear someone introduce me as very kind, says if famous anything, a part of me is always like, what the? Oh, I totally think about it like that.
I totally know what you mean, because I totally know what you mean in the sense that, like, I don't think of myself that way either, because I hear somebody famous and I think like Beyonce or like a pop star like that. And so content creators and just our new and strange and crazy world kind of occupy this middle space, and maybe we need a new word for it. I don't know.
We're B-rated famous.
Exactly. I'll take it. I don't need the gifts or the curses of A-rated fame. But right. It's actually a perfect segue, because one of the things I like to talk a lot about, and one of the things we want to talk about today is, these words that we use, like a word like famous can have like all these different meanings. And I know one of the things you talk a lot about is emotional manipulation, emotional abuse, emotional neglect. And I was really curious, as someone who describes themselves as an expert in these things like you do, how you go about operationalizing that definition. Because one of the things that I think is confusing to many people, myself included, as someone who is a practitioner, is that the impact of someone's actions or inactions can vary so widely on an individual. And so understanding how to objectively assess something like emotional abuse or manipulation can get very tricky. So I would love to know how you think about that.
Sure. I guess I think about the definition and delineating the function, maybe being a little bit different from each other. As far as the definition goes, I would think about it pretty generally as intentionally using tactics to instill fear, shame, to get someone disoriented, to put someone on their heels, so that they cannot think outside of the confirmation biases instilled with those emotions. And when people can only operate um, with fear or shame, you're stuck in a pretty small space with the ability to seek truth, and you become very suggestible to whatever the person across from you wants to impress upon you. It puts someone in a pretty one down position.
Okay. Okay, so
Yeah,
let's break that down a little bit. I really
sure.
like your definition, and I'm pleasantly surprised at how specific it is because I've asked this question to different people before. For example, I had a really lovely conversation with Nancy McWilliams came on the show, and she's, a legend in our field. And I asked her how she thought about it, and she quoted what's the name of that Supreme Court justice when he was talking about pornography? She's like, well, you kind of know it when you see it. And I do think I really
Sure.
appreciated how broad that was in a sense, but it didn't necessarily allow me to it didn't provide me with any like clarity or specificity or guidelines in terms of more deeply understanding it. And so yours is very specific. So let's break it down. So the first is it's you listed three, I believe I counted three. You said fear, shame, and or guilt. Were those the three emotions?
Mostly fear, shame. I think we could think about shame and guilt probably being pretty synonymous in this conversation, like kind
Okay.
of getting into the weeds on there's something wrong with me and hiding with shame versus I did something wrong and wanting to make amends as with guilt. But I would say emotionally with fear and shame with the goal of disorientation cognitively.
Okay. Okay. And the goal, I also noticed how it's kind of like this, for you, there's this 1-2 punch in how you define it, where there's the disorientation, and then there's this state that one is in, given that disorientation, where there's opportunities for undue influence that ultimately leads to the control.
It
Okay.
is any type of abuse comes down to power and control.
Okay.
and and that will be the intent of someone who is behaving abusively is to gain an undue level of influence over the person and or people across from them.
Something that I know I've seen in my comment sections, and I'm guessing you get in yours as well, is, well, does it count as abusive if they don't know that they're doing it? If they're unintentional or if they're unconscious, then does it count?
Does a dog that doesn't know that its behavior is aggressive, can we still consider that aggressive behavior, and would it be at risk of um, threats to their being for exhibiting that aggression? Yeah, it absolutely counts.
I agree. I've been thinking recently, what do you think about this? I've been trying to come up with a better definition for self awareness because
Hmm,
that's another one. That's another term that people throw around a lot. And I know that for
sure.
myself, there were periods of my life, let's say 5 years ago, where I like to think of myself as pretty self aware in multiple different
Hmm,
domains. And now I
hmm.
look back on my behavior and I'm like, oh, like I cringe, like, in a good way, right? Like I've
Sure.
grown since then. The cringe is proof that I have grown. And so I've been kind of thinking about understanding self awareness is not just in terms of being, mindful and present of your emotions and your thoughts and not just being able to conduct a cogent self analysis, but your ability to be an observer of yourself and your behavior. And if someone is not a good observer of their behavior, if they're emotionally abusing someone, to your point, it's a point I agree with, that doesn't change the definition or the impact of what they're doing.
No. Yeah, no, I would agree with you. And I think Buddhist philosophy has been talking about beginner's mind or developing the capacity for observer state for eons, right? Um, and part of self-awareness does require this. This is the beautiful part of egocentric processing as human beings is that we can observe ourselves as an entity uh, from third person. It was totally weird for animals. On the negative side, we can get lost in that, or the less functional negative positive. What are these things? Less functional side, we can get lost in those places. But the beautiful side is the capacity for this self of observation, and maybe even for self-awareness. We might even be able to borrow a little bit from the research around attachment theory, and saying that this is about our relationship with ourselves, and to be a good enough parent, to have a good enough level of self-awareness means 1/3 of the time we should be giving ourselves permission to be making mistakes and being humble about it and being real and accountable about it. Another 1/3 of the time, we should be actively looking for ways that we might be going off course and playing into our own scarcity, or confirmation bias is a phrase that keeps coming up here, assumptions. And then the other 1/3 of the time, we should be actively and successfully attuning to whatever emotional experience that we're having, being real with ourselves about reality checking the assumptions that come with it, and settling upon something that seems reasonable enough.
Excellent. I really liked the tie into kind of the Eastern Buddhist perspective, as well as the attachment. How do you understand the intersection? What's coming up for me is there's kind of this intersection between like maturity or lack thereof, immaturity, and emotional abuse. I think about, a 5-year-old, that tries to instill some fear in me to, have a extra dessert or something. And there's,
Sure.
it could follow like the same process of what you're describing. But, me at my age, interacting with a 5-year-old, there's something almost kind of cute, about
Sure.
it. Kind of like when a puppy bites you before its teeth come
Capable
in.
of
It's
doing
kind of,
harm, you.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And, obviously where I'm going with this is, as you get older, once you develop teeth, it isn't so cute anymore. But as a practitioner, I can't help but wonder if that's my entry point in for having empathy for, like, if I'm treating a patient who is being emotionally abusive by your definition. Is there a component of maturity that you think about?
Absolutely. I think there's probably a pretty direct correlation between maturity and the propensity towards becoming emotionally abusive. Is the more emotional maturity we have, the more we can consciously come to terms with and work through whatever emotional experience we're having, rather than relying on repression to stay in denial of the discomfort. When we're practicing the repression to stay in denial of the discomfort, that's when we are going to project that discomfort onto other people, those assumptions on those around us, try to control environments, control other people. And again, similar to teachings of Eastern philosophy, the more at peace, the more compassionate we are with our own human experience, the less of a need we have to fester in resentment and attempts to control, remaining attached to variables that we don't get to control.
That's really, really beautiful. How do you understand the difference, if there is much of a difference, between emotional abuse, as you've defined it, and emotional manipulation?
I think emotional abuse is a type of manipulation. I think about all power and control tactics as manipulation and coercion. And they're really the bread and butter of controlling someone in an abusive relationship or controlling a populace. The icing on the cake is the physical components. Sometimes the physical is there, controlling a populace, whether you have a police state or not. Sometimes a physical component is there if there's physical violence in an abusive relationship. But the bread and butter is the manipulation and the coercion that creates the shame, the fear, disorientation, suggestibility. And I think the emotional abuse is just one of those tactics of manipulation that is specifically used to create shame.
Is manipulation always negative, like abuse is?
I don't no, I don't think so. Because we've talked about children or puppies a moment before.
Hmm. Yeah.
If you're going to be a good enough parent or caretaker, you have to have an idea of what, if any, problematic behaviors there are, which ones are antisocial, what the goal is for shaping a new behavior, and how that's going to be pro-social. And then we use that privileged relationship to help this being who we have this sacred kind of one-up relationship with to learn how to execute that differently, in order to empower themselves, not to serve us. And that's the difference, I think, between healthy socialization, which we could call a form of manipulation, versus power and control.
Mm. And in the latter, there is an emphasis on shame or inflicting unpleasant emotion for the sake of control.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm thinking about a clinical hypnotism book I once read. I'm trying to remember what it was, but the point is that the two authors, it was like a written version of their lectures, and they kind of started the lecture with one of them, says, hypnotism is not real, it is all made up. And then the other one goes, all language is hypnotism. That is all language is. And then they kind of like go into the teaching about, kind of clinical hypnotism and the art and craft of it, and the way you've delineated manipulation from a general concept and then distilled it down into how it can be emotional manipulation, can manifest as abuse or something akin to it. That really highlights something for me, because I think sometimes people get lost in the operationalizing of the definition, and they might say something like, well, aren't therapists being manipulative with their patients? And sure, they are, but assuming the therapy is conducted, ethically and properly, it's not a relationship in which the therapist seeks to control or inflict shame. Shame may come up in the processing of whatever's happening, but
Sure.
that's a very different occurrence.
Absolutely. So someone might say that about their doctor, that they're trying to help you stop smoking, like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought up comparing, an individual instance of manipulation or control or abuse, and kind of comparing it to societal emotional control or abuse. I really wanted to ask you about a video I put out there. I mean, at this point it was months ago, where I talk about the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict, and actually bring up emotional manipulation. For those of you who are watching and listening that haven't seen the video, we'll play it for you now. I'm going to lose followers for saying this, but that's better than losing my integrity, so I don't care. I'm an openly gay American man, and I support Israel. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. Some of you are going to say, wow, a therapist who doesn't care about dying children? What a psychopath. Here's what I have to say to all of you. You're being emotionally manipulated. Imagine that you and I are married, and every time you draw a boundary with me, I smother our kid with a pillow and say something like, "Look at what you're making me do." I would be emotionally manipulating you. That is exactly what's happening in Gaza right now, and most people agree with that because it's obvious. And if it's not obvious to you, then you either have another agenda you're pushing, or you've been emotionally manipulated. If you're being emotionally manipulated, you should talk to somebody about that. Ideally, that person is not some woke terrorist apologist therapist. And if you want to see more content from a mental health professional who has the emotional skills to look at today's events with a little bit of clarity, you should toss me a follow. And if there's a little part of you that feels like they don't have the skills to cope with today's events, then I want you to comment the word Substack below, and I'm going to send you a free article. In my newsletter, The Mental State of the Union, we're going to use psychology to navigate today's increasingly complex world. You're not alone. We got this. I'm curious what you thought of. Well, I guess I'm curious what you thought of just like the video in general, but specifically the thing that got stitched and sequenced, further than I could even track from the metric side, was people were talking about this very topic that we've defined, what is manipulation? What is emotional manipulation? And I was curious to get your thoughts on not just how I went about making the video, but the message of the video and I guess the cultural conversation that people had in response to the video.
Yeah, I don't think our culture is very good at having productive conversations right now. We do a lot of discussions. We do, yeah, a lot of discussions, a lot of like dyad concussion. And people, it seems like we've fallen out of the art of dual logos, creating dialogue and building story to have mutual truth and understanding together. It's probably happened for many different reasons that we could get into the weeds sociologically and anthropologically around if you'd like to nerd out on that stuff. The conflict, the war between Israel and yes, some people would say they're targeting Hamas. Some people would say they're using this as an excuse to further subjugate Palestinian nation and citizens. It is just so incredibly loaded and tricky. And I mean, and this is even coming from someone. So my grandfather was an Auschwitz survivor, was rescued by Oskar Schindler, worked in Schindler's factory in Krakow, Poland. He was 14 years old with his 12-year-old brother at the time. 6 other siblings died, both parents died, which was really, that's the majority story. The story of survival, or much more narrow, and don't hear much about it because not many people did. He and his brother lived in Israel for a while. Many Jews did, because there was no freaking where to go. Nobody was. It was not an option, and to be anywhere else. The lead up to World War, to the final solution, as named by Hitler. Parts of that story involve boats, huge boats full of Jews put on there in Germany and taken from port to port all throughout the world, in virtually every nation saying, no, we don't want them. United States included here, folks. This was the only place for Jews to be safely in that time, after almost getting wiped off the face of the earth. A very, very old, very kind of sacred personal history, going back to a relationship with Israel as a nation, as well as the concept of it. And at the initial parts of the conflict, Israel's response was pretty synonymous to how the United States responded to 9/11. And it was kind of a trip for me. I was 17 years old when 9/11 happened, and I got I was kind of checked when I was taking a look, like, hey, don't y'all remember 9/11? And talking to people who, no, they didn't. They weren't alive. They didn't like resonate with that. And just because the United States did it, there could also be an argument that how the United States responded in having a fight fire with fire response to a terrorist group who is trying to bait a reaction. They knew that they could bait a reaction that would fuel their own cause, that would inevitably put people in a position where they're getting bullied around by a much stronger institutional power, and kids that are 5, 15 years old, and say, look, here's proof of these oppressors. You should join us. And it worked. It will continue working, as oppressive institutions are too easy to bait with responses like this. And then all the upheaval afterwards, with people being really black and white, 100% supports Palestine, and really black and white, if you're not supporting Israel, then you hate Jews too. It was just so incredibly unhelpful for figuring out what the heck was going on, as well as trying to have some sense of realism and compassion for the position that these human beings are in. And I think all too often the content that we create when we go out on a limb and take a risk and really put ourselves out there on like something like you did, folks are going to hone in on one specific part of it because it's creating this kind of uproar and this escalation, and they're just going to continue escalating with it and try to continue that emotional climate paying forward. And I would imagine that to some degree that's probably what happened. And I would imagine you were probably receiving some very colorful messages during that period of time, as it's all traced back to you. That would be a pretty uncomfortable position.
Yeah, there's so many things I want to reply with. Here's how I'll go about doing it. So, I've never been to a bar mitzvah before. Where I grew up in California, I think the Jewish Heritage Club in my high school, I think there were maybe like 3 members. It just wasn't a thing where I grew up, and I'll never forget. It was actually my freshman year of college. For whatever reason, some aspect of Jewishness got brought up, and I was just probably like hanging outside, like a dorm building or something, and forever got it. It was like everyone there was Jewish but me, and I was like, oh, this is neat. Like I just didn't have there was no bias, there was no in favor. It was just where I was, and over the course of my life, I was have been very serious in a previous relationship for someone who was Jewish, and I would have converted for him had we worked out. And I'll never forget, there was a very specific instance of anti-Semitism, of someone who glorified Hitler to his face, and I was there, and it was one of those things where you almost have to like pinch yourself, and like look around, and you were like, I was like, wait, what did you just say? Like, it was, I'm laughing, but it wasn't funny. I was mortified, first of all,
Sure.
because this was an acquaintance of mine, and I think the experience just affected me, someone who is not Jewish, just like I think it would affect, I don't know, a white person who, witnesses racism, or
Sure.
maybe a straight person that witnesses homophobia, or something like that. And I always, held on to that. And when October 7th happened, for a while, I made the decision that I wasn't going to speak publicly about it, because it is so charged and it can be so unproductive. And on other cultural issues, I haven't been, making content that long, but that was always my strategy, and I always felt very good about that. I actually had a very successful video where I talked about, the psychology of propaganda. I don't know if you saw this one, but it was very artfully vague, and it was fascinating because people in the comments, thought I was against them or for them, and like all, and I was like, this is the
Projecting
point.
all the things. Yeah.
All the things.
Yeah.
And I felt very good about that for a while. And then I think as time went on, what I'm really building up to is what motivated me to just kind of take the risk and say what I said and put my thoughts out there was a few different things. Number one is, it became apparent to me is that it wasn't just strangers on the internet who I'll probably never meet in person saying things, and you don't know if they're trolling or if they're who they are or where they're from. It was people in my life, that had very strong feelings, that were very, everything ranging from, very Zionist, very pro-Israel, to very pro-Hamas. And I would say that, and I use that word, and not Palestinian. And of course, there are people who are just very pro-Palestinian and sympathetic. And it was so astonishing to me how, in a matter of months, I felt like the climate for people who I've come to know and love, who do identify as Jewish, it felt like, in some instances, they were getting sent back decades, just in terms of stigma and in terms of just general socially attitudes in a matter of months. And I thought that was the most incredible thing I'd ever witnessed. I have some friends here in New York.
It's never gone anywhere.
Yeah.
It's never gone anywhere. Yeah.
Fair enough. I have some friends in New York who talk about 9/11 and how that really impacted them personally, philosophically, politically. And watching the West's reaction to October 7th, I would articulate in a very similar way. And so that was one thing, and then the other thing is that watching the just the unrest of the college campuses, was very, because I remember being in college, and I remember people who are very right or people who are very left or whoever they were protesting for different things, and there was always this attitude of, well, they'll grow out of it. And as someone who left college and has still kept in touch with many of his classmates, I'm here on the record to say, yeah, a lot of them don't. A lot of them actually get more extreme in whatever ideas or views that they formulated there in academia. And I would even put myself in that category. There are some things I've changed on and other things I feel like I've doubled down on. And, they're not going to be young and powerless forever. They're going to, many of them are children of privilege. They're going to inherit a lot of capital, a lot of influence, and they're going to decide elections, and maybe, even become political themselves. And so that was the other thing that motivated me, because I think that for me, I wanted to let people know what I thought. And specifically, and the third thing, and this kind of brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, I couldn't get over the unhelpful and unproductive state of discourse where it seemed to be a perfectly acceptable point to end on, where people would say, well, you have to be on this side if you care about women, innocent women and children. And and fair enough, because I mean, who is against women and children? I know I'm not. I don't really know anyone who would say that this is it. But for people, it just occurred to me as so lacking of internal emotional boundaries to say, well, this is the permissible stance to take, or this is the socially acceptable thing to say, because this is what has been introduced. You talked about disorientation earlier. I felt and still feel to a certain extent a lot of people keep quiet because they would feel so ashamed, to get messages or to even think that it's possible that someone thinks about them as someone that is so reprehensible that they don't even care about women and children. And
Sure.
That's why I put the video out there like I did, because I really wanted to let people know that this seems very emotionally manipulative to me. and, and I have chosen, a career with a public image. I signed up for it. I'm a big boy. And I will end on this and say that, and I think that the clinical training and my clinical experience that I've gone through really helped me prepare me for that. Because I've had, clients and patients who, in their process of things have felt very strong feelings towards me, and we've always worked through that and come out the other side. But I've had so much practice not internalizing that and not making it personal. And so that's what I felt called to do. And that's why I did it.
And I'm glad you did. And I think the more people give themselves permission to stand in their own light by expressing their own authentic thoughts, feelings, and positions, the more it will challenge this assumption that truth is black or white, that most truth doesn't happen in some kind of universal capacity, and it's all gray. And that's one of the oldest tricks in the book for how the bourgeois, or how folks who are who have all this institutional privilege and influence, the top 1%, keep one half the poor fighting the other half. They keep all of us just at each other's throats, being convinced that there's an irrevocably clear right way or wrong way, and judging each other, shaming each other, trying to scare the other off of their position. It's the yucky part of tribalism.
I was, as we're recording this, for those of you who are listening, the DNC convention, the presidential convention. I believe it's ended today or ended yesterday. But I was very present to what you're talking about when I was looking at the footage. Vice President Harris Kamala put out this Instagram post of people at her convention with and they were like waving American flags, or it was something very patriotic. I can't remember exactly what it was. And then the next slide, it was people presumably from a Trump convention that was basically saying, mass deportation now, And then when I go and look at, Republican or conservative news or social media or whatever it is, it's the script is completely inversed, and it's like, they're the patriots, they're the ones that love America, and it's these other ones, and it's, it's such a basic structure for a story, right? A hero, a victim, and a villain. And all you got to do is just, assign people to different roles. And it will always fascinate me how effective that narrative structure is, regardless of whether it's politics or something else.
It's truly scary how simple and effective it is.
What this brings up for me as well, my decision to kind of put myself out there like that, as I did, is it really, well, if I'm being, perfectly like bold and honest about what I think about my decision, it's like that took some balls, and
Yeah.
When I was kind of processing, the implications of it, that was something a mentor said to me. He didn't use the word balls, but he goes, not everyone has the guts, not everyone has the stomach for it.
Sure.
And I
Much more
really,
refined
I really
version.
appreciate it totally. And I really appreciate that reflection. And it was, before I did it, I was, and this person in my life is a man. He's very masculine, and it was so interesting, kind of contrasting his advice to another person who I look up to in my life, who is a lovely. I mean, they're both very integrated. They both have this lovely blend of masculine and feminine. But her stance was, kind of like what you were saying, where it's like, well, to what extent are you actually, contributing to the conflict, the polarization, by being so bold, et cetera, et cetera. And she had such a, she was coming at it from a much more kind of, place of inspiration and possibility, and hope. And I noticed that he, kind of, for me, reaffirmed this, he kind of gave me permission in a way. It's like, it's okay to go into the arena. It's okay to go take a stand and be bold. And I'm not making either one of them wrong. I'm more just noticing this, the dichotomy, right? Like the masculine and the feminine, and yin and yang. And I wanted to know, because I know you wanted to talk a little bit about masculinity in the modern age and fatherhood. And while these are not my parents I'm talking about, they are parental figures, as my mentor.
Sure,
I could,
sure.
if we want to be humorously Freud about it, they're mom and dad, right? And they had completely different pieces of wisdom. I just wanted to share that with you. I don't really even have a question about it, but it's been top of mind for me lately.
No, I do appreciate you sharing it. I'm glad to hear that you have some of those folks to lean into who you respect. I think we all need those folks, and plural folks. And I also want to make sure that you hear that I wasn't, I don't know how it, apparently it came off that I was saying that you added to the dysregulation or disorientation of the populace in doing so. And I did not intend to convey that. What I really intended to convey was the boldness, and how in putting yourself out there, we need more of that from as many different people as possible to disrupt these binary dyads, the ways of thinking. That the fire that's been burning since the world's been turning, about this tribalism stuff, it is just so powerful that it gleaned whatever it wanted to from what you created, and used it to fuel its own fire. That's what it does. That's not what you didn't do that. You put yourself out there.
Yeah, I appreciate that reflection. And to that point, I didn't necessarily interpret your words as that way, at least not overtly.
Okay.
But I think it was more just a commentary on, I do get her point when she was basically saying that, you kind of like, well, if you're going to like fight fire with fire, like I understand the metaphor of that. I guess what I just want to clarify is I want to say that, and sometimes you need to do that, because like you said, it's occurring in reality as it is, and so.
Absolutely. There was a time in social media land, I guess I'll just kind of refer generally to the ethos of where we tend to function, um, where I was speaking really directly about how a lot of uses of narcissistic personality disorder being used in ways that are not informed by the research, that muddy the water and make things more complicated and harder to heal from and more polarizing, in regards to abusive relationships and abusive people. And got a very, very similar reaction. And there were some parts of it needed to happen, and I wouldn't change if I could. And there were other parts. Glad I learned some of those lessons, and wish I could have learned them in different ways. It is definitely an uphill battle speaking directly to outraged people. That folks have to do it. We've got to do it.
I would love to see for you to send whatever material you're referring to me. I'm not sure I've caught that from you, but that's one of the things I'm very passionate about. It won't come out till next year, but I'm working on a book, and I'm kind of taking term by term by term, whether it's narcissism or whether it's something else, and and I think it's important to have those conversations, and I think it's okay for people to have big feelings about them. I think this is, if we're going to really destigmatize mental health and kind of integrate related conversations into the ethos, if you will, this is an expected growing pain, and we should lean into it because it'll just make us taller, bigger, better, stronger.
Agreed. So, it started as the kind of really plainly just saying narcissistic abuse is not a real term. It's not a real term.
Oh yeah, you definitely pissed some people off with that one.
Oh gosh, so many people. And this is someone who's specialized, partially in intervening in domestic abuse, and identifying intersecting social locations and informed by privilege and oppression that are super dynamic. And like studied at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, founded and based in liberatory psychology, and it was amazing to me that initial uproar that probably lasted a couple of months, and getting tons of hate emails and threats and just all kinds of stuff. It's like, y'all really, like, you're talking to a dude who works in the cause, who like helps other, specifically men, a lot of times identify their abusive behavior, and there are all these other research-informed ways of doing it that are reliable and valid. But what y'all have come to here, you've created an echo chamber, and they did not like it.
Yeah. I was recently got present to, again, it's been out for at least a couple of years, but some literature that came out around like victimhood signaling. And what they found was that it's a key strategy for people who are narcissistic and psychopathic. And for those who are listening, that does not mean that if you disclose victimhood status because something horrible happened to you, that you are narcissistic or psychopathic. What it means is that people who are narcissistic or psychopathic will prey upon the empathy and compassion of others. And it's it's great to have it kind of validated in the literature. I don't know if we needed the data to know this to be true, just because I don't know. I think as I've gotten older, you just get a little less naive, you get a little more mature, and life humbles you. I've certainly been, just as a therapist, as someone who is a very compassionate personality and a big heart, I've certainly gotten taken advantage of that way, and I think it's, in some ways, it's very obvious. And so I have all that to say is I have my suspicions about the the ego needs of the people sending you hate mail. Let's
Oh,
just say that.
yeah. Yeah. Me too.
Yeah. And on that topic, the one of the other ones that kind of gets obscured in that world of talking about emotional abuse or narcissistic abuse is gaslighting. It's so often confused with disagreeing or remembering things differently or not accepting someone else's version of events. And while we're getting ourselves into some much worthwhile trouble just having all of this conversation, what I often think about is how if it were just as simple as disagreeing, the antidote for it would be so easy. You just disagree back. Like, you just don't let them correct you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it would be it's such a simple boundary to draw, but that's not what gaslighting is. Gaslighting is a very, slow and insidious grooming process. And as someone who has, treated the survivors of it, they are not well, and they really need some therapeutic attention. It's quite something to live through.
Absolutely. And that's where I tend to find the use of power and control wheels super, super helpful. These guys here,
Yes.
to delineate the tactics of what people describe as gaslighting in pop psychology. So you don't have to rely on this word that's very charged and loaded, and again not rooted in reliable, generalizable, valid data necessarily. And yeah, like how often is it just people don't know how to have dialogue with each other, and they have this, used to seeing hashtag gaslighting everywhere. And like, oh, well, I'm uncomfortable and I don't know exactly what you're talking about and how you're talking about it. You're gaslighting me. Like, whoa, where are they blame shifting? How are they using
Right.
privilege to make the executive decisions about knowing what's best for you? How are they diminishing your own, are they playing off of your own isms or phobias? How are they doing those things? I don't know. It don't feel right. When you know it, you know it. As you said earlier, like, well,
Yeah.
apparently you don't.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more to that.
Yeah, totally. Well, when people, particularly loved ones, disagree with me, I don't feel right because I am right in my memory about everything, obviously.
That's how humans process
You know,
information.
totally. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you also have to kind of think about the kind of mental state you would be in to not have that assumption that your version of events is correct. That in itself is actually a state of consciousness that some people come to therapy for, and it's quite debilitating, you know?
Like psychosis.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, totally.
Yeah. The,
Yeah,
the degree
so
of
it's
ego is what keeps us together.
yeah. Well, let me ask you this, since I know you're really informed by a lot of kind of the Eastern way of thinking about these things. Something I see get thrown a lot. Something I see get thrown around a lot is this idea of like ego death. My immediate reaction is always the same, and I have a really hard time looking at this concept any other way. But I'm just like, no, but you need your
Yeah.
ego. Like I don't know which theorists you're following, but I think all of them, agree that it's a necessary part of you.
So, someone who lost their face on tour with Grateful Dead in the mid '60s. Um, I mean, like, so what ego death looks like is someone who has consumed an extraordinarily macro dose of psychedelics,
Right.
where their whole perception of self and time continuum is thrown off completely, and they're experiencing moment to moment as like a flip picture show. That is like the subjective. Like, I don't know who I am. People who are walking around in the streets who have been manic for way too long and have their face painted blue and have a tinfoil hat on their head to protect their thoughts from the aliens who are saying that they're Jesus Christ. It's like, a part of me always wants to go like, no, Bob, like, you are Jesus. Like, I'm Jewish, and it's a really helpful allegory to understand that, like, you're worthy of unconditional love and you're a piece of God and an agent of change and beautiful in your own right. Um, you don't have to go march to get nailed to the cross now. Like this is not like you're Bob, bro. And but they don't. It's not there. Um,
Yeah.
ego, a degree of ego is required to maintain identity.
Hmm.
Without ego, we don't have identity. You don't have an awareness or an ability to observe self as an entity.
Yeah.
It all just gets lost in translation. I think the goal is not ego death. If that was the goal, you just rip a bunch of DMT or take an enormous amount of ayahuasca and you're healed. But that's not how it works. I think what those folks tend to be getting at is an ability to move through life without being so attached to variables that we don't get to control that we end up white knuckling it, and in doing so, participate in our own suffering, as opposed to going, ow, that hurt, that was pain, that was information. What is this teaching me about what I'm experiencing in the world or myself? What are parts of my identity that I might need to have a more detached relationship with, or maybe even grieve, go through some of that existential development? Like that that's the goal. the,
Mm.
uh, the ego death is psychotic.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, what do you think about this? This is a conversation I had with Therapy Jeff when he came on the show. We were talking about how to be a professional. It doesn't, you don't have to be in mental health or self development, just really in any industry, and to, kind of have a public presence. It probably requires at least a decent grandiose coping style to stress and conflict. Like the one upping versus like the one downing, because you're going to get, no matter what you say, you could say the sky is blue, and you'll get like a hateful email, right? And I'm thinking about this in the context of ego, and really how people who are listening can think about ego as it relates to making them more resilient to emotional manipulation, emotional abuse, etc. What do you think about this? I'm open to deconstructing it, or getting feedback. I have an ego, and it's something that is, to your point, it's integrated. It's not something that, like I necessarily suppress. It is important to me to feel successful. I like it when videos do really well. I don't like it when they don't do well.
Yeah.
When I help my patients, even one on one, and like, no one else is there but just us. Like I still get that ego boost when I see it become conscious, or when they finally put it together, or like whatever it is. And one of the ways I think that I navigate anyone who could potentially be abusive or manipulative to me emotionally is I actually keep my ego really conscious, and you don't make it right or wrong, right? But you kind of like keep it there, and then when it's there, you could then be aware of how people might be poking at it or not. That's just one of the ways I do, and I'm wondering, A, do you agree with that, and B, are there any other ways you can think about, whether it's related to ego or not, helping people navigate any potential emotional abuse or neglect, that manipulation, anything really that's kind of happening in their life?
Sure. As the people who have a degree of spotlight as far as how they function, or to the B-rated famous, what we were joking about earlier, that have to have a degree of grandiosity to how they cope with stress. Um, Probably to some degree. I would be curious whether it's more about grandiosity or a temperament trait of disagreeableness, of
Mm.
a willing to get combative, to engage. Um, for me, I guess that's what I find to be one of the most helpful motors that I have,
Mm.
is like I'm just not willing to take stuff lying down. I'm not.
Yeah.
Never have. Even growing up in an abusive household, being the scapegoat, and pretty early on, just being like, mm-mm, I'm not doing it. and you can vote me off the island and torture me if you want to. Yeah. I think a degree of that is required, because there's so much speaking up about things that are just against the grain, or not accepted in the dominant discourse, or whatever. I think some folks tend to trend towards the grandiosity, or kind of a degree of entitlement around it, and some folks less. I've probably ebbed and flowed a little bit in that course in my own career of creating content, and to a point now where sometimes I wish I cared more. I'm just like, oh my God, I'm just like burned out of sitting in front of this ring light and doing this
Oh my
again,
God, I totally
and
get
going.
it.
Um, and like if I had more of my personhood that I am imbued into this, I'm sure I would hustle harder. But like today, I just don't give as many fucks, and I'd rather get a high volume leg day in than do another hour of recording or whatever, because it's going to help me sleep at night, be more regulated, and put like all this stuff that is just more closer to how I tick. What was the second part of that question? Because I was joking
Um,
about grandiosity, how I don't have it, and then got
well,
so involved in answering that question.
oh, well, to your point about, I I agree that thinking about just temperament and personality is an important variable in the analysis. I'm moderately agreeable. I'm incredibly compassionate. I'm not very polite, which I think makes sense if you've gotten to know me either through my content or just personally. And for all those who are listening, politeness is about it's about deferring to kind of like norms and customs of how people get along. It doesn't mean you don't say please and thank you.
I mean,
And
rude. Yeah.
and the other thing that we were talking about, I was just kind of curious if there was a way to connect ego to helping people, or the awareness of ego. But it could just be, as we get towards the end here, really any advice you have as someone who really works so intimately in this area. What do you want people to know about in terms of navigating emotional abuse or manipulation?
To surviving through those experiences with as much as your own humanhood intact. Um, First and foremost, familiarize yourself with power and control wheels. Learn to speak the language of your oppressor, and quite well. My grandfather spoke 6 different languages. One of them was German. He spoke German quite proficiently, and even though did not speak it actively for the last 4 decades of his life. You got to know what the people are talking about that are trying to get you and how they operate. The more that we can recognize the shenanigans and not have to rely on whatever assumptions that we make in our fear or our shame or our disorientation, the easier it is to protect ourselves from those tactics. So part of it is awareness and training awareness in those spaces. Every time you have a funky interaction with the abusive parent, the abusive spouse, your abusive government, whatever that abusive entity is, bust out your power and control wheel, log the event, and then go through your experiences and name what each tactic was. Practice. I always think about it the same way as a young family therapist, when I was like, oh my gosh, I need to figure out how to do genograms automatically, and they just feel so clunky. And you're like, God, just like, okay, well, I'm just going to watch Intervention nonstop and make a genogram every time, and eventually it just becomes second nature, becomes routinized. And the more routine you make it, the faster it lights up, and the less you have to roll along with homeostasis, and the more you can maintain your own due north.
And that's great advice for anyone who's listening who is training or early in their career in terms of being a psychotherapist, in terms of tracking the people in your client's life. I never heard that, but that's cool. I might have to try that myself and see if it makes me any sharper at just kind of organizing all the people.
Absolutely. I mean, and so in working with individuals, something that the internal family systems model came extraordinarily naturally. Um, because the first time I meet somebody, within the first half hour of that first meeting, I know all the central people through their socialization process, and who was internalized, who was idealized, who was feared, who you decided to be like because you couldn't beat them, and in ways that folks hadn't consciously considered at all.
Yeah.
So when it came time to move around those variables and parts, had all the pieces. It came quite naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like how the looking at the power wheel, speaking the language of the oppressor or the abuser, what you're really saying is this is how you get out of that disoriented state. This is at least how I'm taking it, because you're going to be disoriented, but if you can point to what they're doing, like you brought up blame shifting earlier in our conversation, if you know what that is and you can spot it, it doesn't have as much power over you. At the very least, you won't be as disoriented.
Yeah. I hit you because you deserved it. Well, just because you say that doesn't make it true, and that's actually a tactic. So I'm not. What's coming out of your mouth is propaganda. It's not. It's not valid or reliable.
Right. Well, there are definitely lighter notes to end on, but we're going to end there anyways because I think it actually kind of captures a lot of the essence of the conversation today. And I could easily talk to you for another hour, but we have to go. As we go, any parting words, anything you want to say, and where can people find you?
Where people can find me, I mean, you can go on social media, on mostly any platform except for the dumpster fire known as X, at Healing Humanity 777 on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. I'm on YouTube under my regular, my name, Logan Cohen. I'm like God-given. I'm a parent-given name, Logan Cohen. And my parents were pretty cool. They're not gods. Um, I have a website called logancohen.com. There's a whole course, like a coaching course that I've created specifically for men around their personal integration, looking at emotional intelligence as the missing link of how they go about doing that and creating balance in their own lives in modern society. You can find that at balancemanplan.com. Parting words that I would have for folks are whatever you have been through, no matter how painful and scary, those experiences are not excuses to keep yourself from the world. We need you. Human race needs you. Nature rewards biodiversity. We're all here for a reason. And we need you out here doing your thing. So whatever you need to heal from, that is just fine. You do the work that you need to do. And meanwhile, we'll be sitting here waiting for you to come shine your light. It's needed.
It's absolutely beautiful, and that is absolutely what we have to dive into the next time I have you on.
Sounds
For
good.
those of you who are still listening and watching, this is Therapy versus the World. Please like, subscribe, rate on whatever platform you're on, and we'll see you next time.